Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Several studies indicate how violent imagery is increasingly being shown on TV and, of course, on social media. But what is the impact of people being exposed to on-screen violence? Should there be greater censorship to reduce disturbing visuals? More importantly, with a noticeable trend in more gruesome shows and movies being produced, should we question the human fascination with watching violent content? On tonight's show, we explore this topic in detail. Joining us for this discussion is Ms. Nour Zaqqout, who's a media expert joining us from Gaza. We're also joined by Mr. Dimitris Aristopoulos, who is joining us from Greece. Thank you both for joining us. So, Ms. Nour, let me begin with you. Do you think that violent imagery is becoming more and more commonplace on social media?
First of all, there is a relationship or association between exposure to violence and entertainment and the violent behavior that appear on TV. But it's not proved that exposure causes violent behavior. There is a risk that exposure to media violence will increase the subsequent aggressive behavior, and this risk can be increased or decreased by the large number of other factors, and it depends also on who watch and who are the viewers. But I want to say that the violence is portrayed plays a critically important role in relationship to its effect. Also, these effects plays from on-screen violence can be short on long term, it depends. And many studies and research have argued whether or not the portrayal of violence in the various media causes violence in society, and the relational studies have all been used as investigation tools.
Right. And Ms. Nour, stay with us. I want to ask Mr. Dimitris here, while we're talking about violence being depicted in media, and many studies indicate how there is an evident increase in it, from TV shows to the news to everything that's on social media, how do you think that impacts society?
It's well known since ancient times that every form of art, whether that's poetry, theater, and the entertainment arts are no exception to that rule, that every scene and every picture shown to the people, most especially the youth, influences in a high degree both the psychology and the mentality of the people to be motivated to such actions, as you say. Other factors also increase that form of behavior, with most especially social ones. And I believe that art is and the media news are a great exemplar to the young people to follow that
So, Mr.
behavior.
Dimitris, just picking up something that you mentioned here was that violence is not just depicted in media these days, but it has an ancient history of being integrated into art, theater, and music, and many various forms that provide entertainment to audience. From that, do you think that people in general have a sort of fascination with violence, and that's why it's brought into so many different mediums?
It would be wrong to attribute the whole of it to only visionary pictures. There are certainly many more factors that cause people to follow that kind of behavior. It's their environment, the praise that they may receive from society, but I think that art and entertainment are main factors that may give a motivation, I should say, to the people to follow violence as a solution for their troubles.
Right.
And the exemplars the news may follow are also play an important factor.
Right. And what do you think when people are exposed to more forms of violence, increasing forms of violence, what exactly happens to the human psyche?
Every human being has a tendency for imitation of his of other people in his society, and when he's exposed to such pictures, we should say, he usually imitates that form of behavior because he feels some form of psychological confirmation, we should say, that
Right.
he's doing the right thing.
And hold on to that, Dr. Dimitris. Ms. Nour, while we're talking about this, something that might seem very crude, but we often hear is that pain sells. And often that's why it seems that it's depicted more and more in media. Would you agree with that? Pain sells, and that's why there is more need to show it on screen.
I want to say that it's not contended that television violence is the only cause of aggression and violence in society. And the aggression is determined behavior. It's the product of number interacting factors, genetic and neurological, physical, sociological, environmental. And it's only when there is convergence of factors that violent behavior occurs. But it also has a big impact on people like adults, children, like the most of children. And
right. But Ms. Nour, taking a step back, we see that when violent tendencies emerge in people, there are several factors because of it. We can't attribute media as being the only source. But why do you think media is depicting more and more violence now?
Because of the news and the things that we face every day and we see on TV, and it has the most proportions of violent impact on children, like response to violence and increased fear of a crime. Violence in the media may contribute to violent crime, but it's not like a single cause. That's what I'm saying. Like, because there are many other factors which contribute to some to this violent behavior. As some people like children, they imitate what they see on TV, on video games, in their real life. And violence on screen may reinforce their behavior of already aggressive people, and the relationship between viewing the violence screen images and videos like what we see here now, and the exhibiting aggressive behavior appears to be bidirectional, And the aggressive people are more likely to see violence, the violent images and the news, and there is a relationship between them.
Right. And after Christchurch, saw how on social media something as violent and gruesome as that terrorist attack was so became viral, instantaneous. So now in this era where putting something up on social media can have mass reach suddenly in a second, how do you think that is becoming more dangerous to controlling narratives and to controlling content?
As for sure, there are many regulations to be taken in this field, as the children are most risk from these effects, and young people may also be at risk, and males they are slightly more at risk more than females, and the general public is concerned about the effects of the on-screen violence like we see now. Parents have an important role to play in supervising their children and the young people, and teaching them the differences between television or film violence or what we see on news, and if that's wrong or right, and the real life. There is a relationship between real life and fantasy,
Right. And Mr. Dis, while we're talking about all of this, how there are so many instances taking place and what happens on media subsequently, what do you think happens to the viewers who are watching them? Do you think they become more desensitized to violence? Is that an increasing trend you're witnessing in society?
The behavior that people follow when they imitate all the entertainment is a logical consequence from most especially with their behavior in real life, because many studies have shown that people tend to imitate everything on TV, from the fashion, what the products they advertise. Well, the violence can also be increased by being advertised that way, with the increasing life and societal problems in real life as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Dimitris, for joining us and talking to us. Nour, going back to you, how do you think that the news cycle is such that we see more negative news? Do you think that it's designed in a way to put out more violent images, more graphic images?
I want to say something. As like with other forms of violence on television and in news, there is a concern of the reporting of suicides in many areas and in many countries like Australia, of suicide, homicides, and violent criminal events on the news. Like, for example, children and young adults will result in imitation actions by some individuals. For example, some studies show that the number of suicide deaths recorded have increased after news reports of suicide, particularly where the reports detailed the method used by the victim and where and how. They imitate what they see, and the thought of reporting of these strategies may also have triggered the events which took place in many countries.
Right. And Ms. Nour, stay with that point. We're also joined by Mr. Alexis Poulin, who's a journalist joining us from Paris. Thank you so much, Mr. Poulin, for joining us. Now, you as a journalist, what can you tell us about the ethics of reporting violence? And what do you think, where should the line be drawn? Where should the line be drawn between this is too much violence and it should not be shown to the audience?
Yeah, I think if you don't show the reality and the gross reality of violence, meaning especially what happened with the Yellow Vest protest, people losing their eyes and hands and things like that, or if you're covering a war, if you don't show violence, then you take a stand, a political stand, because you minimize what the parties are doing in prisons, and you minimize the violence that is used to curb either manifestants, demonstrators, protesters, or the violence that is used by a regime in a war. So, as a journalist, I think there is no limit to and the only duty that you have is to stick to reality as close as it is, as gross as it is, and you don't have to censor yourself or pretend that it is not to be shown to an audience, because this is what actually is happening on the ground, and the people who are suffering from any kind of violence want this to be known and shown. There is no question about that. No, the limit to this is the staging of violence, when people will actually try to pretend that either one party or the other use violence against them, but you don't show what happened before, especially in protest. It's very unclear sometimes, but most of the time it's very clear. And we, in France, for example, have seen police violence that should never have happened in a democracy. So it's very important to show them, and there were not enough journalists doing so.
Right. And you mentioned an important point here, that when you try to censor violence, censor what is actually happening on the ground, you are taking a political stand. Now, we also see, and there are many instances of this, when media sensationalizes what has happened when maybe the death toll is misreported, either it's done intentionally or unintentionally. Now, this is, of course, bad journalism. But how does a person reconcile with that? How does the viewer reconcile with that? Whether this is accurate reporting or whether it is a sensationalism, glamorization of violence to promote a certain narrative?
Well, it's all about trust and it's all about ethics. I mean, it's either you do good or bad journalism. The problem is there is a lot of bad journalism out there, and because it's clickbait and it's to get more viewers and to get traffic or whatever. And that's a problem of fake news to the end. But most of journalists, I would say, have the correct ethics and do a journalist's work. The trouble is when communication comes in and it's all about making communication campaigns rather than reporting of what's happening. Even when you do clear and proper journalism, it's difficult. It takes time because you need several sources. You need to make sure that you're not instrumentalized by the people who show you the violence, for example, or bring you to a chemical weapons site or whatever. Look at the big U.S. media. They all fall for the weapon of mass destruction lie of the Bush administration. And they did an excuse for this, or 10, 15 years after that. And not the journalist at the time said, ooh, it's weird, it seems like it's a lie. So it's all about ethics, and it's all down to the trust you can have to a journalist. And I'm sorry to say, but trust has been attacked because of what was in the Iraq War, because of a lot of lies that have been perpetrated by democracies and not denounced by journalists. And that's the problem we have now, is trying to find the truth out there.
Right. And hold on to that thought, Mr. Poulin. We're also joined by Mr. Benjamin Wolf, who's a journalist. Thank you so much, Mr. Wolf, for joining us. Now, as Mr. Alexis was talking about the situation of violence being depicted by journalists, and he talked about how it's necessary to depict reality and show the true picture. Do you feel that when media shows more and more violence, it desensitizes the audience, and in a way it counters the main aim, which is to create empathy within the people for those who are suffering at the hands of violence?
Yes, definitely. I think we've got a situation here where especially also private TV shows and movies and so on became more and more violent just because that's what viewers wanted. And the media had to react to that because people were not really shocked anymore by real pictures. So they used more and more graphic material. But I absolutely think it desensitizes people, and it even to some degree badly inspires some people who see that they can get with their deeds and newspaper like headlines and pictures there and their names, and then they might be, when they don't see other purpose in their life, they might be driven to do some of these terrible things just to get on the front pages of newspapers.
Right. So where does the line, where would you draw the line between ethical reporting on violence, but also making sure that it does not inspire further violence as a journalist?
I think personally that we could do with a lot less graphic pictures. I mean, people know nowadays, unfortunately, know how dead people or badly injured people look. Most of the time, there's no need to actually show that. I think, yes, what you do need to show probably is if there is, if a regime or somebody with military force attacks their own population, for example, or if things like this are happening, you need to show it to see this is really happening. This is something unusual. But if lone wolves or terrorists or criminals are shooting or killing people in some ways or badly injuring them, I think there's no need to show that. We all know how terrible that is, and we all know that these people operate with these terrible pictures, and that we actually help them by showing them again and again and again.
Right. it's played on loop and it shouldn't continuously be shown on screen. Mr. Alexis, going back to you now, we were talking about how the news and how journalists might, how they should cover violent crimes and violence in general. But do you think we're putting too much blame on the news for desensitizing audiences? Now we see even in entertainment, more gruesome movies are coming out, more bloodshed TV series are coming out, and they are attracting a mass audience. Do you think that the onus should be put on the entertainment industry?
I don't know. It's an old debate about does the graphic violence in video games or movies actually make society more violent, or is it because society is violent that we use this as a narrative in hard work? I think we are living in a violent society, which is less violent than it used to be in the past, but yet we are violent animals. Humans, I mean, we are making wars since the beginning. We are fighting. There are murder every day. This is something about the way we are made and the matter that is making us. And we can't just avoid this or pretend that violence doesn't exist or is not core to the identity of humankind. I think it's best to accept it, acknowledge it, and denounce it, even in fantasy work. If you look at the success of Game of Thrones, for example, it's all about the violence that was shown. There was a debate about this, but it's about a fantasy world. Yet it tells a lot about the violence we can see every day, somehow in the power-grabbing system, in policy, and what else? Yes.
Right, and Mr. Alexis, you're making a very strong and interesting point here. That we're going to take a short break, but stay with us, you as well, Mr. Wolf and Ms. Nour. We're going to continue this discussion when we return. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Mr. Zubair Babakarkhail, who is joining us from Kabul. We're also joined by Mr. Rameez Makhdomi, who is joining us from Srinagar. Both are journalists. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Zubair, let me begin with you. Now, you cover Kabul, a conflict zone, and you cover stories of people. Tell us the difficulties in doing so, the complexities involved in covering human stories with sensitivity, often when they involve a lot of violence.
I think reporting from war zones is very different from reporting from the peaceful environment. I will give you a small example. Sometimes I meet journalists from other countries and neighboring countries. Make a small joke with them. I tell them I wish I was same reporter as you, reporting about showbiz and reporting about Bollywood and Hollywood, you know. For them, if two celebrities starts an affair, that's a big news for them and breaking news. But for us, working in a war zone, the major bomb blast or the big car bomb will be the biggest for us. And that's why, you know, we always in Afghanistan reporters say now we became just counters of dead bodies and wounded people. So in a war zone, we mostly cover violence, fights and clashes and suicide attacks, as well as humanitarian stories. If people suffer somewhere, if people are in danger somewhere or bombed somewhere, civilians. So we report on that. But in such environment, you need to be very careful about reporting. You have to be neutral. You have to be, you must not take any side. And even using words, different words, you know, like in your story, you have to be very careful to not harm any side by using any word. You have to be independent. And plus, you have to be very skillful and trained for the war zone reporting. I mean, if you are not like a hostile environment trained, that will be difficult.
Right. So, Mr. Zubair, something that you mentioned here is you have to be very careful and you have to remain neutral while reporting. Now, these are very emotional stories, I'm sure. Deaths taking place, bombings taking place, lives being lost, lives being destroyed. A journalist as well, would be overwhelmed with emotion. How do you remain neutral in these instances?
Yeah, it's sometimes very hard for us when you clearly see that civilians are harmed either by the Taliban or by ISIS or by the government side or by the American bombardment. You see that, but you can only use what you saw and what you heard from people. Cannot our own opinion in any story or report any. We cannot express our thoughts. That is the difficult thing for us. That you feel really bad about civilians, about people, about your countrymen,
right.
but you cannot express your thoughts as a reporter.
Right. And Mr. Zubair, thank you for joining us and talking to us about your experience. Following from that, I want to ask Mr. Rameez, is your experience similar to that Mr. Zubair talked about? Does it take a very real toll on a journalist covering these stories?
Yes, as you know, Kashmir is a very tragic place. Kashmir is the second name of tragedies. Here you have to cover a lot of stories of human pain, human death. I believe a journalist should also cover what are the impacts of these deaths on a society and family. That's much more important. And how we can contribute in knowing the real genesis of the issue, the real causes of the issue. We need to communicate that to the world so that the issue behind this death and destruction comes to an end. A journalist has to be neutral here. He has to take sides of neither state.
Right. And Mr. Rameez, sorry to interrupt here, but working in Kashmir itself, tell us about the difficulties that are specific to this area. How reporting is hindered? What are the difficulties that journalists face in reporting the truth?
Well, in Kashmir, the journalists are walking a very tight rope from every side, especially as you know, the state restrictions are there on the journalists. So Kashmir, like place, is a very cutthroat for journalists. They have to walk a very tight rope where they have to be first cautious of their own lives because they can be eliminated anytime. And in past 30 years, Kashmir has seen assassination of several journalists. So in Kashmir, journalists have to bear a cautious threat as well while reporting. These are the pearls associated with the conflict zone like Kashmir. But despite that, you have to be representative of since you have hold a pen and a mic. That's the oath in itself that you will portray your truth. So it's very difficult to report from a place like Kashmir because that's full of violence and full of tragedies. So you have to walk a very tight rope, and sometimes you may be succumbed as well because.
And Mr. Rameez, when you watch how Kashmir is covered in main media outlets, in Western media outlets, in Indian media outlets, what are the sentiments that run through your mind?
I am a close watcher of media. I watch, but to me, in current world, no media outfit or no media institution or no media house can claim to be 100% unbiased. There is a sort of degree of bias in even Western media outlets. Even I believe, despite that, unbiased reporter should try to be stay impartial because I believe everywhere in world, India, the nationalism tendencies are eating up the journalism. It is the nationalism threat that's because you have to bow the line of nationalism. Otherwise, you are facing risk, be it in Afghanistan, be it in India, be it in Pakistan.
Right. So, Mr. Rameez, what it seems to be that you're saying that nationalism, national narratives color reporting, color what the media is trying to report, which should be objective always, but now it's being colored by these sentiments. Thank you so much, Mr. Rameez Makhdomi, for joining us. Mr. Alexis Poulin, going back to you, when we were talking about ethical journalism, now this is a question that often comes up, especially when photojournalism is put in the spotlight, that should a person be covering misery or helping the person at hand that is the subject of their pictures, subject of their story. How would you respond to that? How do you see that debate?
Well, there's no debate really. I mean, it's very hard, and war photographer, I've told that many times. I mean, they suffer from taking the picture. I mean, it's a violence to themselves that they're doing, but they take it because they know that if the picture is published, then it could be a game changer. So they have to take the picture and not help the person. Sadly, that's the way it is. Other people will be there to help, medics and the Red Cross and whatever. But so it's violent because you have to question yourself about your humanity. But saying, I'm not helping anyone, but maybe I'm helping by taking this picture, or maybe I'm helping by saying what I have seen with my eyes, and not being in the action, but just being the witness for everyone and the witness for these people. So it's very difficult for the journalist to be in this position.
Right. And Mr. Alexis, you said that when a journalist thinks that maybe you're not helping that person directly, but they are helping the cause some way. Tell us more about that. How do you think that they're helping the cause by covering it in this way?
Well, because they would be the only one able to cover it with this trust that people have in journalism, saying that I won't be covering one side or the other, but I would just be covering what is happening in this region of the world where nobody can access, or it's very difficult to get there. So that's where they have a social role and a role in the helping of a cause. If you say, especially when violence is in use, or chemical weapons or whatever. So it's very important that the journalist stays in his witness role and the most close to what truth is on the ground, so that people can make their opinion in the rest of the world.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Alexis Poulin, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Benjamin Wolf, going back to you, we're talking about violence being depicted more often. Is that a trend that you do see existing? And do you think that that's the trajectory, that it's moving upwards more so than before?
I think that's not that easy to say. It depends a lot on which media and also in which countries. I think what you can definitely see is that in these recent terrible events that struck many Western countries, so in Europe and North America, that you've seen an uptick in violent pictures there, because these countries just feel like they had a period where there was not so much violence in their country, open one you could say, and now this has hit them, and they put it on the front pages. I think that's not a good trend, as I said before already. And overall, I think, as my colleague before said, it really matters a lot what you do with these pictures and what you are reporting on. If you actually transport the message of the people perpetrating this violence, if it is their explicit goal to produce terrible pictures that go out and terrorize a lot of people, then you have to be very aware if you as a journalist want to be that person who really shows all these pictures. If on the other hand, you've got a strong
And how do you make sure that you're not sending out the message of the person who's perpetuating the violence? And in fact, you're just reporting it and you're making sure that it doesn't trigger any copycats.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing. I think every journalist must ask themselves this question. And I think it's a different thing for governments who usually want to appear legitimate, and if they perpetrate violence on their own population or even like some other organization, then they don't want to get these pictures out. So then it's really the obligation of the journalist to report that and to show that. But others, as you said, who really want to get these pictures out, we have to be much more careful, and we have to,
Right, and do you think that there should be any widespread guidelines which make sure that everyone's on the same page? All media organizations, whether it's news, entertainment, or any other platform, they're all on the same page in how to cover violence and how to bring it within their stories.
I think you can't bind the entertainment industry. What you can do is maybe say, okay, in these age ranges, but you have that already, what is appropriate for certain age ranges. Otherwise, artists are free in a sense. What should happen, what should exist, is a guideline for journalists where you have several steps before publishing a picture, where you reflect on is it necessary to show this kind of picture, and does it actually further the story or not? Does it perhaps actually serve these people perpetrating this violent act, or is it necessary to show this to the world?
Right. And let Ms. Nour back into the conversation as well. Ms. Nour, we've heard of the Christchurch call that Jacinda Ardern gave out after the Christchurch attacks, getting everyone on board to have a greater crackdown on social media when it comes to violence and hate crime. What more do you think that the global governments need to do in order to tackle this issue of violence spreading on social media?
First, I agree with what Mr. Alexis from France said. Despite the on-screen violence actually pleases the viewer and leaves them to be frustrated after watching the violence videos and images, but there are no few or consequently portraits such as the real emotional or remorse and physical pain and legal consequences, and the vulnerable viewer who is presented with a false impression of what is reality and how the reality of violence may be more likely to engage in this violent behavior, being unaware of the real consequences. So I'm from a country where I want everyone to see what happens here, because the other sides who did these violent moves they do their part and what they want their efforts to forbidden these journalists from covering and recording what happens here. So I feel sorry for people who don't know about us. I want everyone to know, but because I know that every viewer feel the frustration and melancholy and the sorry for people who face this violence, but there are, as I said, some violent some regulations need to be taken.
Right, but Ms. Nour, as Benjamin was also stating, that some sensitivities need to be adhered to while reporting these things to make sure that they don't inspire others. And this definitely holds true for when covering terrorist attacks, those acts committed by extremists. So given that, what controls do you think that need to be put in place?
I think that acknowledging the potential impact that watching violent scenes on television or videos has on individual and society at all, it noting that different people will respond differently to similar cases. The policy challenge is twofold: to enhance media violence awareness and responsibility amongst the public, and second, to avoid mechanisms which could trigger unacceptable behavior and this on individuals. And the new technology which can empower individuals to control what information is received or accessed in their own homes by public health and the education in schools and by the advices of parents on their children.
Right. And Mr. Benjamin Wolf, going back a little to something that was highlighted by our guest earlier, Mr. Alexis Poulin, which was that when violence is shown on screen, it might just be a reflection of society because society itself is violent. So all these dystopian shows we watch, all these violent medieval shows that are coming out that are extremely violent, while they might be fiction-based, they do in fact reflect some segment of society, some fascination that people have with violence. Would that be something you agree with?
Well, they certainly do. That's why I also said entertainment, art should be free, and if people want to watch it, they should be able to watch it. I think there's no point in restricting that, even though there's an interesting trend. There's a journalist who works a lot, not a journalist, a historian on the history of violence, Steven Pinker. He wrote a book, and he makes the case that actually we've become significantly less violent in total, and that this could just be a reaction to this, as you say, nature of people who still have this violence in them, and they live it out in a way through watching these things, but not actually doing these things in their own life, at least the large majority of people, which would be a good thing in a way. So I think there is definitely a place for these pictures. I just think news reporting should handle them very carefully and very selectively.
But in these times when we're seeing an increase in conflicts, we're seeing an increase in humanitarian crises, do you think it's even possible to create more care in the media realm, in the news media realm, to cover these issues with greater sensitivity?
Yes, I think more care is always possible because it also improves the quality of the coverage. Because what you also see is that often people switch off if they are overwhelmed by pictures. I think the context is important and the reporting needs to be done well. And what you often get also in I can often speak, of course, from the European or American perspective, but what you often get there is this impression, okay, it's all going down in some other countries. We just have to shut the doors because it's anyway all a chaos. There's nothing we can do about it. And I think journalists have to counter this effect and say, no, this is happening in this place. It's happening for these reasons. These are the actors here. And we have to be specific and not just splash graphic pictures on the screen and just say all is terrible, there's nothing we can do, because that leaves you and the viewer in a position of powerlessness, and that's not what news media is about.
Right. And Ms. Nour, one last question to you. We were earlier talking about the instantaneous nature of social media, how you can post something and within seconds it's out to the masses. Now, with that, and of course, we've seen examples of when the live video recordings could be misused on Facebook and other platforms. Do you think it's time to shut these down because they cannot be controlled otherwise?
I don't think so, because censorship is not a satisfactory option when it involves limiting access to information, which as a proportion on the public claims it has right to access. But there is the self-regulations play a bigger role. For example, the governments or countries has to the advisory systems have to inform viewers about the nature of a program content and what to watch, and to be responsible with the scheduling this. And this can help the viewers or who's sees the violent images, impact of on-screen violence, and this will be play a positive role on the pro-social program showing healthy cooperative behavior. For example, what said Mr. Benjamin, it's up to them to say the entertainment thing, but I'm talking about the news and the real, what happens in many countries. They have the right to show people what happens and to feel the pity and sorry for these people. But about the entertainment, they have the whole right to see or not to see.
Right. Right, and thank you for the last comment there, Ms. Nour, for joining us and talking to us as well. Thank you, Mr. Benjamin Wolf, for joining us and talking to us. It was great having you. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.